Thanks so much, Peter. Okay, exciting. Nice to see everyone. So welcome to today's Courageous Conversations series webinar on climate justice and green colonialism. Today, we'll hear from a range of voices from across the world, using case examples including Palestine, Australia, and South Africa. Our wonderful speakers will reflect on how climate justice intersects with colonialism and the fight for social justice. Today's webinar is being recorded and captions are available in English if anyone needs them. Click on the little CC button or icon at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Or if it doesn't show, there should be 3 dots or a more button for you to click on to get the transcript. For audience members who may not be aware, the Courageous Conversations series of webinars is led by Atlantic Fellows for Palestine, who are Atlantic Fellows drawn from all 7 Global Fellows programs. The group has previously held internal and public-facing discussions, encouraging the Atlantic Institute to live up to its equity-focused mission, and discussions reflecting on the experiences and resistance to genocide and corporate complicity, and how we can bring about change in the spaces where we are. I particularly want to thank some of the fellows behind the scenes who put so much effort into organizing these webinars, including Peter, Goris, and especially Rauda. Thank you for your ongoing solidarity. Today's speakers bring many years of experience understanding and addressing the causes of climate breakdown and environmental exploitation. And of course, they are speaking in a moment in time where for a few days this month, it seemed like we might tip into global conflict once again. Indeed, we may still do so, driven by colonialism, imperialism, oppression, greed, and genocide. Reflecting on a statistic someone shared with me just today, spending on war is almost double spending on climate action, and war spending looks likely to increase for now, while also trashing climate and environment. Before introducing our first speaker, I'd like to cover some ground rules for today's discussion. The webinar is open to the public, and all attendees today are encouraged to introduce themselves by name and affiliation in the chat and when asking a question. By way of example, my name is Laila Adwan Kamara. I am a consultant in disability and mental health based in Ghana, and I'm an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity. We're looking forward to an interesting discussion today, and everyone is expected to behave and speak respectfully. Disagreements are expected and viewed as part of our growth, but disruptive or hostile behavior is not welcome. And anyone who doesn't adhere to any of these ground rules will be removed from the webinar so that the rest of us can have an informative experience and insightful discussion. Each of our 4 panelists will speak for about 10 minutes each, after which we'll open the floor for questions. Our first speaker is Enamul Mazid Khan Siddiq, known to his friends as Enam. And he's an international development practitioner focusing on climate justice, anti-colonial environmental governance, and indigenous community rights over natural resources. Enam has more than 14 years of experience in local and global evidence-based advocacy for transforming environmental policy and practices, especially those related to transboundary river basins and coastal and marine ecosystems. Currently, he works as a program manager for Oxfam International's Asia region. In addition to being a senior Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity, Enam is a distinguished Humphrey Fellow on Climate Change and Natural Resource Management and a Kinship Conservation Fellow. He is also a Rawson Scholar at the London School of Economics, or LSE, Geography and Environment Department's PhD program. I'm really looking forward to hearing from Enam today, as he's going to lay out what is climate justice and how does it intersect with colonialism and social justice. So over to you, Enam.
Thank you very much, Laila. I hope you can hear me.
Perfect.
Okay. Thank you for the introduction. I just would start with an assumption that I'm preaching to the choir here. So people know what climate justice is if they're already in this room. But I would rather take the opportunity to engage in more personal level discussions around how we are involved in the struggle that we call climate justice. So I I'm none of those things that Laila kindly put together. I'm just Enam. I'm from a forest village in Eastern Bay of Bengal. The part is in Bangladesh right now. And I represent no organizations, even if they are paying me a salary or a scholarship. So what happened to my village is, for example, this year when I went there for Eid, we don't have water. Like all the ponds, like the general landscape is full of water normally, and it's part of a watershed. It's a valley in the middle of a forest. And all the water level have gone down and people are struggling with fresh water. And what I have seen is like the most devastating thing that I have seen is, which I have not seen before ever. So people fighting over the water. These are like family members. So members of the family who are well off. And when I say family, this is like 10,000 people. This is not, not a small family that I'm talking about. The family is essentially the village. And these are like your kin. So people are blaming that, okay, these 9 families who are the wealthiest, and by that wealth, you don't compare with Mr. Elon. This is like just wealthiest among the villagers. They have been able to put pumps to get water from deeper levels of the aquifer, while others haven't. And the assumption is it is impacting everybody else because they think that these families, 9 families, are taking away water from the others. But I, of course, work on the environmental management side of things as well. The thing is, we have forgotten that this forest belonged to us, and the entire forest, like if you don't care for the forest, if the forest is not there, it's going to have an impact on the watershed and the water level will go down. And on top of that, the rainfall patterns have changed. Now, the reason, the first thing that comes to our people's mind is the pump to, collect the water from the deeper levels is because of the technical fix approach to any environmental climatic water problem that has been like embedded in our minds. We have been taught that climate change, environmental issues are technical problems and you need experts and companies to fix it for you, which means you engage in this race for money that could buy you solutions for your like mere survival. And at the end of the day, the water will not be there, no matter how many pumps that you can install. If the water is not there, you're not going to get it. You're not going to survive. Now, this story is not just the story of my village. It's everywhere. It's the entire planet. And we are taught that these systems of power from the past they belong in the history books. They don't. They are pretty much present. Why do I not have my forest? Why do I not have the power? We don't have the power to manage our forests in a way that we will be able to tackle the challenges of climate change and regain our water systems. Because during the British colonial period, they took away our land rights. Those forests which belong to us now belong to a government. The government, which is a legacy of the colonial structures, the same structures of forest governance that they installed several hundred years back, still govern us. Same native people employed by them. Maybe their revenue is not coming, like the salaries are not coming from a colonial administration. Now it's coming from a native government, but still the structures are the same. And that's where I see the link of climate change and coloniality. So it's pretty much present. So it has nothing to do with the technical matters of environment and climate. There is, of course, but the key thing is the politics behind it. Whether we are engaging with the power structure, whether we are invisibilizing them, or we are able to point fingers at the right people, the people who are still causing the issues. And it's an ongoing struggle. It's not just about climate. Anything that we engage with would come down to the fact that there are a few people everywhere, well connected among themselves, who are trying to dominate the resources, centralize the power and wealth. And in that process, they are harming us all. Some are getting more harmed because of their marginality, their identities. Some are getting more harmed. It's just less or more. But at the end of the day, we are even as I was saying, my family members are fighting each other. So my family is the entire planet. They make us fight each other. They make us put all our money in warmongering industries so we can fight each other, a fight that is not ours. That's where I will stop, Laila. We have wonderful colleagues here who can bring much deeper thoughts and examples from their own countries. And hopefully at the end, we'll get some time to discuss more. But as I will say, this is not about technical fixes. This is not about climate change itself. It's about a system of domination that we need to fight. Over to you.
No, thank you so much. Your explanations were so insightful and so human. And I really appreciate that. I also jotted down some questions, and I hope others did too. But before we come to the wider discussion, I want to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Muna Dajani. And I first became aware of Muna's work through the Atlantic Fellows, and I know you'll find her work truly fascinating. Muna is an action researcher with a background in critical political ecology. Her work aims to understand environmental and water governance through decolonial and critical lenses. Her doctoral research focused on examining community struggles for rights to water and land resources in settler colonial contexts in Palestine and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, with special attention to how farming practices acquire political subjectivity and examining the role of sumud, or steadfastness, and staying on the land as a form of cultural resistance. Muna is currently a fellow in environment at LSE, and previously she explored promising grassroots initiatives of holistic groundwater governance, shedding light on traditional and intergenerational skills and knowledge. Muna is the lead editor of The Untold Story of the Golan Heights, which resulted from her co-development of a collaboration project between LSE Middle East Center, Yazid University, and the Golan Heights-based Al-Marsad. She is also a policy member of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and has worked on a large number of other research projects in the field, which I won't list all. Muna, I could see that you're already embarrassed, but it is such a pleasure to see you again. So I'm going to hand over to you to go ahead.
Thank you so much, Leila, for that very generous introduction. That, yeah, it sometimes feels like Anam was saying, like it defines us, but it doesn't, and it shouldn't. So, it's been really great to do it in the spirit of like really confronting legacies of marginalization and silencing that we are witnessing again today. But thank you so much, Leila. Thank you, Rauda, also for the great invitation to join. And I'm so happy to, in these times, it's really difficult to be happy, but really grateful to be part of this lecture series, and that it's entitled Courageous Conversation is also very much needed in these times of hypocrisy and the laying bare of the inadequacies and the colonial legacies of a lot of like the world order, but also international institutions and international law and others, where we are continuing to witness 630 days of televised genocide against Palestinians in Gaza that has also spread and caused havoc across the region by Israel as a settler colonial state, that we have maybe now will be, of course, continuing to see the genocide happening in the background, unfortunately. So, and like Inam said, it's all about also causing symptoms of disaster and uninhabitability that is very much intentional and laid by design. So I'll start my 10 minutes now. I'm really, really grateful to be here. I really want to spend the next 10 minutes kind of situating how I have conceptualized green colonialism and engaged with critical scholarship on climate justice, but not only scholarship, but also lived realities where communities have been spearheading climate mobilization against settler colonialism, against ecological destruction, and the military-industrial complex. So I have been working particularly in the Levant region, in Palestine, and the occupied Syrian Golan Heights in particular. And my work, and I really will not pay justice, like Inam said, like what do you say, especially among colleagues who know so much, but also amongst really this decades of growing decolonial and anti-colonial scholarship and contributions from indigenous scholars, from Latin American scholars, from Palestinian scholars that have debunked, that have been debunking kind of the inadequacy of different discourses and different schools of thought that have tried to conceptualize in, oops, what happened? Sorry, can you see? No, I don't know what happened. I clicked and it...
We can see you again, so probably you want to share again. Yeah.
Yes. No, I think the picture has a link. That's why it sends me to Safari. So it's kind of just really paying tribute to the inspiration that a lot of scholarship from indigenous scholars across North America and Turtle Island, from Latin American scholars, and from Palestinian scholars themselves, who have really spearheaded conversations that take us and beyond the Western-centric conceptualization and issue framing around climate change being a universalizing issue that requires global interventions, that require global institutions of governance, that really flattens out different ontologies and epistemologies and the understanding of the world and how we engage in it as communities, especially marginalized communities, indigenous communities of the globe. And I really come from that spirit of, confronting those legacies and ensuring that our scholarship, our activism, our mobilization continues to be fueled by that necessity to confront those hierarchies of knowledge, of whose knowledge matters, of whose technological solutions are legitimate, whose science, whose understanding. So like Inam very eloquently said as well, there is a need to kind of confront all of these colonial continuities, whether it is in knowledge production and hierarchies of knowledge, whether it is through that systematic control and dispossession that comes inherently now as part of the world order, and kind of the total absence of our communities and our struggles and our histories. And I think one of the most compelling messages I want to get out of this kind of really appreciation of all of this great scholarship is what Kyle White, an indigenous scholar, has identified that for me really sits with me, and I say it in every presentation, is that climate change that we are experiencing today is only an intensification of ecological violence and environmental change that has been imposed on indigenous people and communities by colonialism that we are still confronting and living the aftermath of. So it's a continuity that we need not be, not to, because the intention has always been to dehistoricize and desocialize and depoliticize our struggles and kind of separate them from the climate catastrophes and environmental catastrophes of today. So in that sense, green colonialism should not be understood as bound into this kind of into this moment in time, right? Because it is structural and it is historical and it takes multiple shapes and forms and it has multiple definitions as well. But one important aspect is not to think of it as, happening now. It's not about the technological fixes only, like Inam said. It actually comes as part and parcel of the worldview where, some lives matter more, and some systems of governance and economic systems of growth matter above all, and everything else in an externality. Places, geographies, people are sacrifice zones, their externalities in the quest for an economy, and now it's also been touted as a green economy. So I come from this also understanding of green colonialism, that it is a process where entities, nation states, but also increasingly, as we see, multinational corporations and companies take on the role of stewardship of making green transitions at the expense of people's lives, at the expense of people's relations with the land, at the expense of land itself, viewing it and conceptualizing it also only as a site of extraction and exploitation. And it has emotional aspects as well that go beyond, again, technical fixes or kind of that separation between nature and people that colonialism has enshrined in the world order today. I will I will jump right away into the cases that I have been looking at and really trying to interrogate and very much unveil how global environmental governance mechanisms, namely the UNFCCC, for example, has really given that responsibility to tackle climate change to nation states, right? And we're thinking Israel as a nation state is also doing its performance and its role in investing in renewable energy, committing to national determined contributions. I'm sure a lot of you know the terminology of increasing its renewable energy contributions and to decrease global emissions, right? So I think what we need to interrogate is how, and how is it happening, at the expense of who, at the expense of what rights to nature are we talking about? And then we see that there are recurring thematics of technological fixes and depoliticization and greenwashing that Israel has been using for decades in order to show that it's a startup nation that has all the technological advances to confront these challenges. This is happening, of course, on Palestinian land, on occupied Syrian land, at the detriment of their right for determination. And also the exploitation of their resources and the obliteration of themselves, like we see now in Gaza, but also their way of life and meaningful connections to the land. And then when we look at it comparatively, we see that a lot of cases are being illuminated today that have been sitting at the background. You know, they've been silenced. They've been forgotten sites of military occupation, namely the occupied Golan Heights by Israel, but also Western Sahara by Morocco. And these sites come to the forefront as the geographies that will offer a solution for green energy transition, right? So we see that these sites become so important in the transition, the green energy transition, but in very invasive, very much at the violent ways at the expense of the rights of self-determination of these communities, their sovereignty over their resources, their right to a meaningful presence on the land. So we interrogated that enduring coloniality of the idea of modernization and technology coming to save the day. And it proliferates, right? These projects of, very massive wind energy turbines, solar panels, or solar villages, solar parks are taking place as we speak in those lands and against the people's will. Very viciously and violently, like we see in Gaza, but also very slowly in the West Bank, in the occupied Golan Heights and elsewhere. And I really want to say that here, another quick message that I want to convey is while we also see this green energy transition and green colonialism encroaching on people's lives and lands and worldviews, we see that people also resisted based on their historical legacy of resisting occupation. So this is where the occupied Golan Heights stands as a really compelling story that people are still ongoing. It's an ongoing fight against the wind energy turbines that Israel is trying to realize to reach its nationally determined contributions. And people are resisting violently. But what we see here, the resistance is not against the energy per se, not against the infrastructure per se, but its imposition on people's lives and its obliteration of their right to exist in place in conditions where they have been denied access to their 95% of their land, where their agricultural land becomes such a symbolic, has a lot of symbolic meaning to their livelihoods and their struggles to remain in those really precarious conditions. So here is where we also see these sites of, rejection and mobilization. And I will end here. I know my 10 minutes is about to finish, but I think it's really important to think about, again, the local aspect and what it means for communities to be fighting against a global worldview and an issue framing that aims to flatten difference, right? That aims to show a one case solution, a one-size-fits-all solution. And to think about, all of these underlying dynamics that we need to keep on exposing and unveiling in terms of the continuous legacies of colonial abstraction, racial capitalism, and exploitation that tend to really define these moments in time of green energy transition. So I'll stop here, and I thank you so much. And then hopefully we'll have more time in the discussion to talk about many of these issues.
Wow, thank you, Muna. This was such a clear case study of green colonialism and why we have to think critically about our adoption of technological fixes. Who do they benefit and who do they harm? So we have two more speakers. So without further ado, I want to introduce Dr. Najma Mohammed. Najma and I were Atlantic Fellows at the same time. So it has been my great pleasure to already learn so much from Najma, and I expect that will continue today. And I can see you blushing, Najma, but it's all sincere and from the heart. So from her early work on environmental justice in post-apartheid South Africa, Najma has maintained a long-standing motivation, implementing and driving transformative and inclusive approaches to policy, governance, and practice globally. Najma has worked across government, civil society, international development, the United Nations, and academia, including at the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, the International Labour Organization, and the Green Economy Coalition. As an interdisciplinary scholar and practitioner working at the intersection of climate, nature, and social justice, she has an interest in knowledge, narratives, policy, and practice that advance justice and sustainability. This includes work on nature and climate policy, just transitions, and economic transformations. Najma writes about and builds awareness of the intersection between social and ecological transformations, and is engaged in community-based climate and ecological action. Najma works in international development and will speak about climate and ecological justice, drawing on her lived experience in apartheid South Africa and the country's journey to embark on a just transition. Handing over to you, Najma.
Thank you so much, Laila. If you give me a second, I've got a presentation, so I'll just share and hope this comes through nice and clear. Okay, thumbs up from someone I can see, that people can see this, yeah? Okay, so thank you, Laila, and I really thank Inam for starting us off because I think for many of us, I guess our participation and the research that we were compelled, the paths we were compelled to walk in our lives probably come from the experiences that we all had, in the countries and the places that we come from. And so for me, I think growing up in apartheid South Africa, growing up in, as some of you might know, one of the most biologically diverse places in the world, but also a country, the biggest emitter of greenhouse gas emissions in Africa, and also have been competing with many other parts of the world as one of the most unequal places in the world. And so it was a journey for me that started, and I thought I'd share an image from my community, from my town that I was born in. I was born in a town just about 40 kilometers from Cape Town. I loved nature from a very young age, but 10 minutes walk from my house, this is the image that I was met with, a barrier. And this is only one example of really how apartheid in a very smooth way carried on, the legacy of extraction, of racial segregation, of economic exploitation and extraction of 300 years, started by the Dutch, well, maybe the first corporate in the world, I think first multinational corporation, the Dutch East Indies Company, then British colonization, and then, the institutionalization of apartheid in 1948. The date might ring a bell for some of us who are aware of that. So it was a very easy very easy pass over of the baton of one system of oppression and extraction to another. And yes, this was, a moment. I was on a geography field trip when I voted for the first time, and I think I probably would have swum an ocean. I was not in my city to vote. Many of us reflect on that moment of transition, that moment of democracy. And this morning, I came across a proverb, and I was telling you, this was sent to me today. And it says that one rain does not make a harvest. And I think when we had that moment of joy of having, I guess, that shackles of one, the shackles of oppression beginning to break, there was, I think, for many of us knew the struggle was going to continue. But there is 3 decades later, quite a concern that, we have 3 decades on. I think the government has got a very, very clear wake-up call that people are not, happy with the result of the elections last year, where the country is going. And the social movements are finally, taking back their space. You can well imagine 3 decades ago, the civil society movement stepped from the civil society space into government because, hey, now we have a government that's going to care for the people. But 3 decades later, we know that that didn't always, materialize in the way that we had hoped and voted for 3 decades ago. And so changing the spatial manifestation of the colonial era and then apartheid that really solidified it in a plethora of laws and legislation to segregate people, separate them. You still find that spatial manifestation hardly changed 3 decades, later. I want to speak a bit about just the environmental legacy, because you will find, South Africa probably is, and I think I have an image later, environmental racism writ large. The location of harmful, polluting industries are all virtually located in poor Black communities in South Africa, with still, historically it's been there and it's continuing because, as many of you might know that engage with the situation in South Africa, the wealth and income inequalities are still clearly and starkly around racial lines in the country. So we had, a huge sort of legacy, and I really like Muna's point about the fact that this is just a continuation, really, of colonial and apartheid policies of resource extraction and segregation and marginality falling upon those who really have borne the brunt of it for 3 or more centuries. There's a scholar in South Africa that says South Africa is like a country that has a 500-year open wound, and we're seeking, to heal it through all means. But it's a journey, as we all know. So at the heart of South Africa's economy is this mineral industrial complex that's rooted in its colonial history, more than 100 years of coal extraction. More than 80% of the energy in South Africa comes from coal, which, as many of you know, is very dirty, very polluting. I won't touch on it much, but the health impacts on the community surrounding these sites, the health impacts on workers has been, devastating. But there's also towns and lives and communities that have been built up around the coal industry. And so for South Africa, it was very, very clear that a transition or a move or decommissioning of coal plants will have to come with an acknowledgement of the people and the communities that will be affected. I wanted to share this image. It's not often that one makes Time, the sort of cover of Time magazine, but this was 2019, and this is one of several images. There's a really wonderful website called Unequal Places by a photographer that captures, spatial manifestations of inequality, and it's taken at different scales, and it just gives you a snapshot of what, life in South Africa today, 30 years later, still very much look and feels like for most Black South Africans. So this was, a report from a visit from the UN Special Rapporteur on Toxics and Human Rights to South Africa in 2023, where, it clearly spoke about the legacy of environmental racism, the fact that it's, the structural inequality, really widespread poverty, unemployment. So enter into this space is South Africa 2015. I think South Africa, sometimes we are the first to do some really good things in the world, but how do we sustain that? I'm not quite sure, but we were the first country in 2015 that had a commitment to a just transition in our nationally determined contribution, which included acknowledging historical legacy and taking it beyond the sort of focus on impacted workers and sectors in the energy sector, looking more broadly across the country, how the trade-offs, I guess, both the losses and the benefits of transitioning will be looked at in an equitable way. So the first year in which countries mentioned the just transition was in 2015, and it was South Africa that, put it forward on the world stage. What then ensued was was a process of really engaged participatory policy making. There's a very strong tradition of engaging civil society through policy making processes. And you will see it's sort of rebuilt in momentum from the National Development Plan 2012 that has a whole chapter again ahead of its time, speaking about the just transition, speaking about historical legacy, to the framework for just transition, which is a more recent report coming out of the Presidential Climate Commission, also produced in a very consultative, iterative way. And then the actual project that I'd like us to talk and think about maybe today, the JETPs, the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, major investments from some of the biggest economies in the world, many of them with former colonial ties and former and existing colonial ties to the countries, pushing investment into countries. So these are some of the countries that have received these major investments. South Africa received the first one in 2021. The US has pulled out, but you'd be able to see the partners: France, Germany, UK, the EU, and other countries followed suit: India, Indonesia, Senegal. There has been, to the credit of the countries engaged, there has been a lot of negotiation to push back on what each of these countries should focus on. And these plans are now in place. So what most of these countries, and I can speak to South Africa, are doing at the moment is a process of mapping, consultation and understanding how to decommission the coal plants, existing coal plants, some of them that have already closed because they're not, functioning, even at an efficient capacity, how to build renewable energy, and how to underscore both this transition with principles of justice. This has been a very difficult journey for the country, because if anyone has engaged with investors, they are generally all have one thing in common, in my view: they are impatient. They are impatient to get the deal signed, to move things along, and they have really pushed for the countries that are engaged, to move faster. Many countries, thankfully, have said no. We will move, at the pace that we will move in a direction that makes sense for the country. It's been very challenging in South Africa, because in one province where 80% of coal plants are based, the opportunities for economic diversification, the opportunities for what, if not coal, what, still needs to be carefully thought of and needs to be discussed and agreed with the local people. And there was a study done this year, 2025, that looked at South Africa's 9 provinces and found that the province where a just transition conversation is probably the most needed, the Mpumalanga province, is where the least progress has actually been made on integrating this vision of a just and equitable transition, both from the diagnosis of the challenge through to the identification of the solutions, and how the investments that are coming in will then, not watching time, I'm hoping I'm on time. So there's been a huge pushback, and what has been good to see in South Africa, I think in the last 5 years, in the run-up particularly to this last election, there has been a revitalization of the civil society movement, coalitions being built, and this was right after the Government of National Unity was formed in South Africa. A civil society movement actually came forward and said, yes, we have a lot to be thankful for. We have had this constitutional moment, in 1994, and the constitution being published in 1996. We have a social contract for what we want our country to be, what we want our country to look like. But 3 decades on, it's not working. So they actually have put forward what they call a social contract for a climate emergency in South Africa. And I wanted to conclude sort of with this, and how this call from civil society, it really tackles, I think, some of the fundamental blockages for, a sort of deep just transition in South Africa. It calls for, we've lost, in a sense, some of the forums for dialogue, which were very vital in the initial years of our democracy. So there was actually a call for a national dialogue, similar to the one that was started at the 30 years ago at the start of the democracy, to happen now, because we are far off track from where we expected the country to be. There was a very strong focus on the fact that the just transition and equity is important, yes, in the places, in the communities, the workplaces and the sectors, but there was a dysfunction within the state. And this was, called out and named, by the civil society movement. And I think, in a sense, the South African government listened and have responded, you know, with a bit more of a backbone and a spine, I think, to kind of like hold its place in a plan that was just not going to work for the country. It's very clear about the fact that, you know, we have this historical inequalities and injustices, but they have not ended. They are perpetuating. And as I've shown you from the image, the inequalities and the spatial inequalities, the inequalities in all indices of inequality in the country demonstrates, you know, the deep-seated legacy of that centuries of racial discrimination and exploitation. I think there was a really important point around the fact that we are, as a country, we are grappling with the systemic transformation. And how do we make sure that it doesn't end up as a techno-centric, techno-solution, and it actually is courageous enough to actually go deeper into the structural inequalities. Again, probably connected to the first point, this clear agenda of democratic planning processes and systemic reforms, because we have lost that. We've lost that as the country entered into this process of bureaucracy and the fact that you had a lot of civil society movement in government. How do we revitalize, you know, what was the strength of the country as we, you know, envision this new future? But I also think in ideas, you know, we often, I mean, I work at the moment in a scientific research institution, and we're also like, how do we bring in indigenous knowledge, you know, and couple it with, you know, scientific knowledge? And I say, like, well, there's sort of a huge assumption in there that indigenous knowledge is not scientific, you know, and we say, oh, let's bring indigenous, and I think speaking to local people, speaking to indigenous peoples, it's not only that they have, you know, an understanding of the ecological system and the understanding of the impact, but they have ideas and narratives and concepts that go to the heart of what's missing in our society today. The fact that we, you know, entirely disregard that relationship with nature. I mean, I think for capitalism to have thrived in the way that it has up till today, it needed a few things. It needed to probably dehumanize people so that they could exploit your labor to the extent that it has. And we had to completely disconnect from nature. So we discount nature completely. And within, you know, narratives, we do find a way. So I'm ending, Lila. I see you picking up on my, I think this was a really important moment for us, you know, this preamble to the Constitution, that we walked a very difficult path. You know, we went through a path of reconciliation, a path that needed probably mercy and forgiveness, and to an extent that I didn't know we had that, you know, within the human capacity to do, but we did. But 3 decades later, and we've only just broken the first part of that chain. It is, I guess, for all of us speaking here today, I think there's the analytical perspective of looking at this and drawing on all of this knowledge to understand it. But there's the deeply personal experience of, you know, experiencing this, I guess, you know, almost a stalled, in South Africa, almost this has been a stalled revolution. You know, we've broken the first part of this chain, but there's so much more to the freedom that our freedom that we need to walk, you know, the freedom of you know, this domination of systems of knowledge, of trade, of finance, of politics, that still really is shaping the world that we live in to the extent that we see today. So thank you, Lila, and if I didn't watch time, thank you for the minutes extra if I took some.
All is well. Thank you so much, Najma. And I always enjoy listening to Najma's fascinating experiences. And I find that South Africa is so often at the forefront of really thought-provoking thinking. And I'm sure that the other panelists and audience are jotting down their questions as well. And I really reflected on what you said, Najma, about this sort of outsized power of coal. And it's really interesting because, of course, South Africa is leading this sort of genocide case at the International Court of Justice against Israel, while simultaneously still shipping coal to Israel. So it kind of speaks to the sort of power and negativity of some of these extractive approaches. So on to our final speaker, who is joining us after midnight in her time zone. So we really appreciate the flexibility and the dedication to sharing knowledge. Lisa McMurray advocates for global South communities to own the rights to their carbon and nature-based solutions, instead of these new industries being yet another neo-colonial extractive expression. Lisa has over 25 years social change experience redressing inequity and injustice caused by neocolonialism and settler colonialism within the
Who's frozen? You've frozen.
Can you still hear me, Lisa?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So Lisa is passionate about strengths-based approaches and the brokering of the right people and partnerships to leverage collective skills for cultural revitalization, sovereignty, self-determination, land repair, and climate change solutions. Lisa has co-led collaborative community development initiatives with First Nations partners in Australia, Timor, Fiji, and more to develop First Nations-led and owned carbon and/or cultural fire initiatives and nature-based solutions. An important component of this work is facilitating a self-determining community development planning process that identifies existing strengths, talent, resources, and skills to leverage in the meeting of community aspirations. So Lisa, we're so excited to hear from you. Please take it away.
Thank you, Lila. Now I have to share. I've got to just, it's like almost actually 1 o'clock in the morning, so just bear with me while I figure it out. Okay, you're saying, let me just get to the proper version. Okay. Okay, have you got that first beautiful slide? Okay.
It is there, beautiful.
My name is Lisa McMurray. I'm part of the Atlantic Fellows for Social Equity here in Australia. I was part of the 2021 cohort, and I am definitely the only one on the call at this time of day. But first of all, I'd really like to acknowledge the traditional lands of the Gadigal and Wangal peoples of the Eora Nation. This is my home. People from Gadigal and Wangal have looked after this country for 65,000 years, and their descendants are still here. And I also want to pay all my respects to other Indigenous people on the call. I work for a small Aboriginal NGO. Our main purpose is really to work with traditional owners to access the new markets around carbon and biodiversity. We're predominantly Indigenous staffed and governed, and we work at that systemic level to really push Indigenous knowledge systems to be leading climate change solutions. And we also work very closely at the grassroots with our partners. And behind me is actually a cultural fire initiative, and I was there last week in Central Australia working with traditional owners, and I'm going to showcase that project in a moment because there is some really great news happening around this space in Australia. I'm just trying to move myself because I can't see my slides, so I'll just pop over here. Okay. Well, a few of us on the call were at Columbia last year. We came together for the Atlantic Fellows climate convening. And as we were saying before, it was just a fabulous, small, intimate opportunity to really hear from each other and see how we can work more in the future to mobilise. None of this will be new to you, but I think, Muna, you said that a similar thing. No country currently invests more in protecting nature than it does in spending money to destroy it. So, that was an alarming statistic that came out just before the Cali COP. We know, we work in this space, that Indigenous people globally look after 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, but the direct funding is less than 1%. The current chair of the United Nations Permanent Forum of Indigenous Issues, Hindu Umaro Ibrahim, spoke. This is actually a picture I took of her as she was saying this. The time for peanuts, and then we experience this in Australia, we get peanuts, is over. Transformational funding is needed if we're all going to find a way out of this mess that we're in. And very much in the context in which we work, Indigenous people are often a tick in the box. So regularly we have many other stakeholders coming to us. They want us to be part of a tender. They've already worked out the design, and literally we get the, you know, the chicken feed ticking the box. So that's sort of the level that we're at, making this known. You know, we're not always popular, the little NGO we work for, because we're making, we're bearing witness to this unconscious bias all the time and making it known. And what we do need is Indigenous climate solutions. There's no shortage of that knowledge. We need to decenter the Western norms and decision-making to enable culturally specific and place-based practices to flourish. And this map is of 300 different languages that are still alive in Australia. They're not all spoken. Some of them are spoken by, you know, a small handful as people are dying, but there's many language programs in place. There are many knowledge systems, but I think, Najma, you also said that we need to a psyche shift around seeing nature and people as separate. We need to really reframe our view that humans and nature and all living things are actually family and kin. And that's very much how Indigenous people we work with in Australia view that connection. And if we look after country, country will look after us. And something we hear all the time in our work is that your flourishing is my flourishing. And basically none of us are well until we're all well. Nothing we don't all know. And just to embed this in carbon farming in Australia and the eco-colonialism aspect to it is, yes, it is another extractive industry and can be very much so in the Indo-Pacific region where we work. There are many standards at play dictating how people implement a carbon project in Timor-Leste where we work. One of the standards dictates the trees that people need to grow because they're fast growing and they sequester a lot of carbon. But what's happening is people are therefore foregoing their gardens to plant trees that they can't eat and then having 7 hunger months. So, you know, this is the impact of these external standards being implemented in the global south. You've probably heard about RED schemes and many other, and the worst thing that can happen is people are totally removed off their land, or at the least these unfair benefit sharing arrangements that see people planting trees for 50 cents US, but then someone else registering the carbon project and a developer from overseas and extracting the carbon rights and making millions of US. So these are the sort of things that we play. We're involved in another program in Fiji and really making sure that people are well prepared when these, you know, dodgy carbon developers turn up on their doorsteps, which there are many of them at the moment throughout the Indo-Pacific. And we also, you know, there's also this clashing environmental ideology. The Savannah fire method in the background is one carbon methodology in Australia, and traditionally fire from a Western perspective has been seen as dangerous and as bad, but really fire is life, and fire has always been used in this country. And even I've got colleagues this week up the top end of Australia who traditional owners who are putting in burns, they have permits and everything, but you know, someone's dobbed on them that they're putting in a burn and the fire wardens have turned up. And the irony of having to justify putting in a burn on your own country that your ancestors have been looking after for 65,000 years is, you know, still very current. We all know greenwashing examples. This is our national carrier, Qantas, who pumps out 4% of our annual carbon emissions in Australia and then offsets some of that by buying a very small fraction through the Australian scheme, which is highly regulated. We have a Climate Act, Carbon Act, a policy, guidelines, audited every year, carbon projects. They buy a fraction of those carbon credits because they're expensive and promote those in all of their marketing, but most of their offsetting is purchased in unregulated markets for, you know, like $1 for a carbon credit as opposed to like $50 a carbon credit. That's widespread. That happens with the top 4 banks. It happens with all the corporates that, you know, they look like they're good corporate citizens, but we know that they're not. And also we have a safeguard mechanism that puts a ceiling on the big polluters, but again, they can they can offset that by purchasing carbon credits, or they can just get fined, of which they often do, and they don't really care because they can afford it. And also we find that Indigenous people and with the methodologies in our Australian scheme are often penalised by bad practice of other carbon farmers. For example, one of the methods was around reforesting, and we saw corporates buying up, massive tracts of land, putting a fence around it, saying they were reforesting, but actually just basically walking away, and there's weeds and, going into the farmer, the regenerative farmer next door. And then so that method was cancelled before even Indigenous people could access that method. And that would have been actually a really good method for people down south. So yes, all of that happens. And I just wanted to show you a little video here of what carbon farming savanna burning method looks like. I'll play it, and then it's a short one, so we'll just play it. So that's a carbon farming method, carbon farming project. And when we think about the technology that we've just been talking about, this is Indigenous fire practice. This is a knowledge system that's been going for at least 65,000 years. We know that because that's as long as carbon dating tracks back, or maybe it's 100,000 years in some places. But this methodology was born out of 12 years of research with traditional owners up in the Arnhem Land, top end of Australia. And this is a carbon project. This is a traditional owner group, the Mudburra language speakers of the Barkly region, Central Australia. I was out there last week. There were 12 traditional owners and other supporting Indigenous mobs coming together for a whole week on this beautiful camp, putting in these beautiful burns at the right time of year, after the rain has finished, when there's still moisture in plants, there's moisture in the soil, the wind is doing the right thing. We're not burning in the morning, we're burning in the evening. And there's no fear around this. This is, this is joy. This is, for us, this is the resistance, but through joy and through the transmission of knowledge. There's kids there, everyone's laughing. It's really a fabulous expression of Indigenous knowledge systems within this market. And the biodiversity market in Australia is also coming online. There'll be more opportunities there as well. I think I've got one more slide. Oh, unfortunately this one didn't play, but we face the same issues that everyone's talking about here in Australia. We're a much smaller country. We have a population of about 25 million. 3% of people are Indigenous people. There's definitely a role for non-Indigenous people to support Indigenous solutions. In this case of this project, particularly the traditional owners of this land trust, they own their land. They're a very small group of people. There's 60 people. So when they've got this massive land that they need to burn for their project, they bring in other people, they bring in other mobs who live nearby, but they also bring in other fire agencies to support. And it's a beautiful example of what can happen when non-Indigenous people step to the side, and Indigenous knowledge systems are at the forefront. And what is also very frustrating, but also gives me hope, is that this knowledge is everywhere. This knowledge is all throughout the world, and our challenge is to influence those, the people with the power and the privilege to acknowledge that and to step to the side, because Indigenous systems will save all of us, not just Indigenous people. Oh, I've got one more nice slide at the end. There we go. We're walking through fire. No one's running away from it. It's very calm. People walk through it with bare feet, like minutes after this has been burnt. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. And I have to say, what I loved about your presentation was the sense of hope and possibility. I think it was a wonderful place to finish the presentations. I think you brought all 4 presentations to a close so well. And I feel like we're in a position now after these presentations, you know, we know what the issues are, as you said, we know what the solutions are to some extent. And so I want to use my privileged position as a moderator to pose the first question to Lisa, but also the other panelists may want to respond too. And while I ask my question, I think other people, I'm sure you have questions, please put your hands up and then we'll take questions in order. So don't be shy. But Lisa, to you and the other panelists, my first question is, how do we overcome the sort of colonial and capitalist greed and individualism to restore and repair the world around us, like both in its physical form, but thinking also about our shared humanity?
Oh, that's an easy question. Thanks for that.
You're welcome.
I mean, I'm getting older, and I mean, I have, you know, I feel that I'm much more comfortable, and maybe I have the privilege because I'm in Australia, and you know, we have soft violence at the moment, we've always had both types of violence, but very much a soft violence at the moment, and a lot of soft bigotry. But I'm very comfortable with seeing place-based excellence, and I feel that the traditional owner groups that we work with, seeing the carbon and biodiversity markets have enabled people to get back on country, and people who've been out of country for 40 years, locked out of country, are able to come back to country. They earn a huge income from this work. They're practicing their traditional knowledges. They're passing that on to kids. They're bringing their old people back. The well-being that comes from that, it's very much bottom up for me. I feel like we can showcase these examples, and we are in the rooms of power. Like my colleagues and my board and my CEO are in the rooms with the ministers of environment, and we showcase this work. But it's, you know, it's light touch. I mean, the response is light touch. We've just thankfully got a new government, and compared to the other governments, they're better, but they've just renewed a gas lease to go to 2070 and they held off renewing that until after the election. So, you know, the same thing, the exactly same thing that we were talking about with South Africa, taking Israel to court, but then selling coal to Israel. I mean, the exactly same thing happens here. So I feel like, as you know, we just have to keep investing in grassroots action and at the top, and we have to find our place where we have most impact. Yeah.
Thank you. I don't know whether any of the other panelists want to come in while we wait for people to put their hands up. Okay, I see Enam and then Muna.
I think I'll let Muna go first.
Thanks, Anam. Yeah, I just wanted to echo Lisa's point. I think it's just sometimes for me, like in these dark times, thinking about how essential it is to kind of contest, like reject those assumptions, reject preconceived notions, and kind of also compartmentalization that we're kind of deemed to always kind of speak to, you know, whether it is, you know, ecological violence, climate change, and kind of thinking, oh, yes, it works. Like Lisa said, it depends on, that's why context matter. Like it depends. Sometimes you can be kind of in the same room of those making decisions and confronting them and making them change. But in other cases, like in Palestine, where like it's much more kind of a mobilization against colonialism and against erasure that necessitates maybe mending relations as much as possible between people and land, and reclaiming rights, first to narrate, the right to be, the right to exist. And I think this is where the existential threats are different all across our region. We're all under threat. Our knowledge systems, our worldviews, our wisdom of our ancestor is being taken away from us, or our older generation are also passing away. So I think it depends, but I think it also, you know, whatever level and scale we are engaging with, we shouldn't lose sight of the political stakes. and then realize that what we are all aiming for is to kind of it's a transformative process. So it will require much more than binaries of like rejection, mobile, or like resistance and or co-option and negotiation. And you have to utilize all the tools you have, but in a way that doesn't lose sight of the political stake, doesn't lose sight of what really is at the heart of the struggle. And I think that is what's important. Not to sell out, to just accept that climate change is it needs techno-managerial solution, and we will just have a say in it. No, but we need to still confront the logics and the knowledge systems that dictate it. So, yeah.
Smuna,
I would not pretend that's an easy question to answer, because it's not. But I will point towards two wisdom that I read from Imam Ali. One is, when we are carrying knowledge, we also carry the responsibility to act. So we cannot unhear what we have heard. We cannot unread what we have read, especially when it comes to the responsibility to transform the systems of injustice around us. And the second one is, when we think about dunya, this world, we have to imagine that we will live forever. When we work for hereafter, we have to imagine that perhaps we're going to just die today. I'm bringing that up because it is going to be many different strategies for each of us. It's not just the diversity of our privileges and our current moment of safety or risk. It's also about the multiple temporalities and realities. One is in our imagination. We have to go to the furthest possible dream that we can think of and try to make that happen. So when it comes to, for example, healing the soil, healing the water systems, reclaiming our forests, regaining our wisdom, all of that, like we imagine the best extent possible. But when it comes to the action that we need to take today, that is where we perhaps have to think about getting ready to archive whatever is remaining, getting ready to pack the bag and leave tomorrow or in an hour to take refuge somewhere with that knowledge, with the plan of action. Also be ready to give someone else refuge. Another comrade will come to us. So that sharing of spaces, and also we have to remember that our governments are not representing us. So, which means these multiple realities within any space, people who see the collectiveness as a process of resilience, as a process to fight back, versus people who don't see it. Like, these are things that will emerge. So it's impossible to give a simple answer for everybody. But from each of our positions, I think we need to think about the worst possible scenario, be prepared for that, to take actions for today, and the best possible scenario and what we can do collectively, not individually, to make that happen. And we have to live with the fact that the healing will not restore everything. If we have lost a limb, that limb is never coming back. We have to live with that, but still have to heal ourselves with whatever we have and make sure that someone else does not lose that limb, like whoever is born the next day. That would be my quick answer.
Okay, Najma, go ahead, and just encourage our audience to put their hands up if they have questions as well.
Oh, I mean, those
Najma.
are really big answers, and I think I'm still reflecting on them and trying to. I think for me, two things I was thinking about, and I mean, the one thing I was thinking, the world at the moment is probably, I didn't imagine I would ever feel the way I do in the world at the moment, but I also wanted to share maybe what it felt like, being in South Africa at that moment, and to see things changing bottom up from the top, the kind of combination of the fact that at a place-based level, at the country level, we kind of came together. We were able to put aside our agenda or our issue and stand together behind, you know, I think one call for an end to the racial oppression in the country, whether we came from gender justice, as a faith-based movement, as a opposition, potential opposition party. So I think that moment of building that, I guess we always speak about intersectionality, but it was such a human moment. I always, when I go living in the UK for a few years now, when I go back to South Africa, I feel fully human. When I put my foot on the soil and I get a home office official meeting me with a smile and saying, welcome home. There's just something of coming back, you know, and the fact that it was so hard fought for that humanity and how meaningful the international and the solidarity was between movements and between the place, the country, and the globe. And I think, what can we learn from that moment, in this moment when it seems that we cannot even, humanity has just left the world, it feels, at this moment. You know, I mean, I think that's, you know, something that I think that there are moments in time when we were able to connect to our humanity, to resist, you know, this level of violence that we're seeing in the world today. And it actually, we were able, you know, to overcome it. And I know I've shared with all of you 30 years later, it's not a great picture, you know, but there's a line that we will never, ever go back to, I think. And then I think the one sort of other feeling that I have about just this, how do we resist this, is that I've struggled a lot about how do I maintain my compass in all the places that my life has taken me. I've worked in the United Nations, I've worked in academia, worked in civil society. They all give a different space for action. But I think maintaining, you know, to those sort of fundamental principles, maintaining that always, you know, whatever the context it is. And I think I've always tried to offer respect to everyone who's in the position of the activist, of the scholar, you know, of the, you know, the UN official, you know, who crying in their office. And I've had to sit with someone crying in their office. You know, we see the structure, but we don't see the human beings in those structures. And I just think that's helped me to kind of make sense of some of the choices I've made in my career and in my life, to still work for the same thing, but in a different way.
Thank you so much, Najma. That was really thought-provoking. There's a hand up from Hamima. So Hamima, maybe you can unmute and come in with your question. Just let us know which panelist it's directed to. And if you just briefly say who you are and where you're from as well, that will be really appreciated. Hamima.
Hi, I'm Hamima. I'm calling in from Malaysia. A researcher in the space of climate change and health, doing heat adaptation in rural community in Malaysia. Yeah, but I'm also working with Heidelberg University in Germany. So, I mean, this is open for any one of you all, especially the academician or researchers in this call. So we know that climate change affects the most vulnerable, right? But most climate change research and funding focus on solutions like mitigation and adaptation, as we know. And a lot of millions of funding are focusing on that. How do you think that we, from the research and academics from this space, can tap in terms of coming with tangible solutions for research in climate injustice in particularly, and then how the solution can have a direct or maybe indirect impact to the vulnerable communities that we are talking about, for example, in Gaza. Okay, thank you.
Who would like to take that?
Well, I don't have a very good news story, unfortunately. I mean, this is something that we face all the time. In Australia, we put in a tender for $7 million to develop a monitoring system from an Indigenous standpoint, and didn't get up, no surprises there. But then we took it, and not one Indigenous approach got up. So it was all universities and everything. But then we took it to a philanthropist who doubled it. So The same thing in Timor. Partners that we're working with on the ground can't access any of the big climate finance because the process is so cumbersome. The process is totally uninhibiting for any NGOs, any grassroots people to access that sort of big funding. So what happens then is all the usual suspects win those contracts, and then it's that same extractive, well, not even extractive, but top-down business model that's applied. So yeah, I haven't really had any good news stories around accessing that big finance. And we have the methodology here in this FIRE methodology that people in Australia use all over the country. It's only applicable up north in a particular vegetation and rainfall area, but we could develop another methodology for the rest of the country or for the many different ecosystems that are around the country, but we can't get funding to do it. So.
Muna, did you maybe want to come in as well?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Hamima, for the question. And yeah, like, unfortunately, not very good news, at least from like, again, my experience also, not only as an academic, but also like being part of the climate, somehow climate movement, but also kind of being engaged with a lot of these projects and funds, is that at the end of the day, it's channeling a lot of that fund into kind of very much, performative projects where it's like, oh, we're going to be doing all of these projects to mitigate climate change. But then at the end of the day, exactly, like sometimes even the terminologies, and even when these projects are realized, I mean, it's usually so detached from people, like, and then if you actually investigate, the way we speak about climate change, the way we frame climate change and the way we frame solutions, it's very much coming from like a very Western perspective, Western understanding. So even in Arabic, usually like it would be such a big gap between conceptualization of what these projects are coming for and what the community needs. Sometimes they overlap in terms of understanding, the realities that precipitation is dwindling, that resources are getting scarce, that we have fluctuation in the seasons and rainfall, and that people, of course, have that base knowledge, and they even have a lot of coping mechanisms to adapt. But then it's just that kind of really huge gap between those projects at the top being devised, millions being channeled into raising awareness and education, and even like, projects, infrastructural projects to address. And then it also really compounded again with the fact that in Palestine, we are now part of the UN, the Paris Agreement, but then at the same time, we have no access to our resources. So that puts you into another conundrum where you're like, what we are producing, the jargon and terminologies and the reports and the studies and the needs and the plans, but then at the end of the day, if you don't have access to the land, and then kind of just, flipping that gaze completely 180 degrees and seeing how communities adapt and resist and find ways to be on the land, using indigenous knowledge and wisdom, knowing and their knowledge of the land, really then kind of really shifts your perspective completely about, how useless and how such a waste of lots of these funds are taking place in Palestine. Because at the end of the day, it's people who are on the land, who have the knowledge and the capacities, are being dismissed for the sake of, speaking a universal language of adaptation and mitigation that really is so detached from reality and kind of really at the end serves, in the case of Palestine, serves Israel. So yeah, like it's a very also not a very pleasant picture, unfortunately. But I mean, it's just also about kind of finding ways to, I don't know, to reject, but also strengthen at the same time. Like, I know that Lisa is speaking of a really interesting model where there is a utilization, like being in those, applying for those funds and finding ways to circumvent, the expectations of this project by bringing indigenous knowledge. And I think this is also a really like great experience to think of, like, how can we then utilize those projects that aim to frame issues in a certain way, in a way that serves communities and serves really transformative resilience and transformative, ways of existing in our worlds. So yeah, it's just yeah, some of the things that come to my mind, but I don't have an answer as well. That is, yeah, any positive or, yeah.
Thank you, Mona. As moderator, it's my job to look at the time, and I think as we don't have any more hands up, we could maybe move to wrap up. I would love to invite each of our panelists to take a minute each, just with some final reflections, maybe even connections that have sort of happened during the discussion today. And perhaps if I could invite our speakers to go in reverse order. So Lisa, I don't know if you'd like to kick us off with your final reflections. That would be really amazing.
Some 1:30 in the morning ramblings, you mean?
Something like that.
Well, yeah, a couple of things I wanted to say too, just to really give my love to my Palestinian peers on the call and in the audience, and we're all fighting here. We have a lot of support for Palestinians from the Indigenous community and from our community. Every Sunday we have marches. I was at an event just this week. I'm also a PhD student. We had a students and staff event raising money for orphans in Palestine. I've got something else on this weekend. It's, we're an active community. I live in my Prime Minister's electorate. I was a Labor minister. I almost swore, because we swear a lot in Australia, but they did nothing for Palestine, so I'm no longer a member. I walked past this morning, there's still a vigil. I shouted out at the top of my lungs, free, free Palestine. So, we are here with you, even though we're miles away. And Indigenous people, that's the struggle. We are both in the settler colonial context. And so I just wanted to share that with you as well. And that for us, I guess, as much as this project in resource management, for the Western jargon, or stewardship of land or land management, is probably one of the only amazing examples. It looks, great, but the rest of the country isn't like this. We had our vote October 14, 2 years ago, for a voice, which just meant Indigenous advice, Indigenous people designing and giving advice across all sectors. 60% of Australians voted against it. So, in light of, the impact that had for people, for Indigenous people, my colleagues who say, look, we always thought everyone hates us, but now we know people hate us. It's taken my colleagues this long to just sort of come back to some sort of resemblance of, resilience, very resilient people, and then having that happen. And I think, so I guess for us, it's very much about small wins, being able to see the joy, people we're working with in that project are speaking 4 different languages. It's still there. So that language, that those systems, those knowledges are not lost. They're sometimes sleeping, but having people back on country brings it back to life. And that's just something I wanted to share. Yeah.
Thanks, Lisa. I'll take over the baton. So I think for me, I just like to say thank you to the fellows who've started, in creating this space for a courageous conversation, for, being able to share the experience of South Africans, and just reflecting, I think, on the point that Lisa raised. I think, it's explaining to someone in words what the connection between the struggle for liberation in South Africa and Palestine mean is not possible for me to do as a South African, other than to say the feeling of solidarity and pain it's really difficult for many South Africans, as we observe and are called to witness, the horror that we all see. And then I think, to stand up and call out in whatever way we can, this the need for us to embrace our humanity. And I think probably just to share the fact that the struggle for decolonial action continues in all dimensions. you know, on the dimension of the ideas, on the dimensions of the systems and the structures, whether they're the knowledges or the governance systems or the finance structures that perpetuate that exact same, you know, system of exploitation and discrimination that have, you know, ravaged, you know, countries and peoples all over the world. It continues. And I think, you know, for us to recognize that and to continue to be honest and brutal about it in our honesty will help us, I think, to be able to dismantle it in a better way. Who do I pass on? Who's next? Muna.
Thank you. Thank you, Najma. Thank you, Lisa. Really for these powerful statements of solidarity, but also convictions of not only the need to confront injustice, but the necessity to enact it and embody kind of alternative worldviews that reject, you know, this what a lot of people have been terming as eco-apartheid, you know, that what's his name? Sorry, Vijay Kolinjivadi and Asma Sharif wrote this really beautiful piece, really beautiful and powerful in a way, titled Palestine Against an Eco-Apartheid World, right? And what they have said is that, you know, Palestine is also, and what's happening in Gaza is just a microcosm of what is to come, and which it was echoed in so many platforms with so many leaders and activists and political activists across different places around the world, especially like indigenous communities, leaders. But I think what is really important is that, yeah, like what is lying ahead is really quite dangerous and very worrying. So I think what is needed and what we have emphasized, I think, in this room today is that solidarity and kind of really pushing and spearheading other ways of thinking and acknowledging injustice and understanding the roles we play in confronting that injustice. However, you know, meager it looks and however gloomy the future looks, I think we all have a role to play. And it is about also kind of shifting the lens. And that's why I say that confront, you know, these systems of knowledge hierarchies and power imbalances, because we need, it's a necessity for us to survive in a world that really is based on justice and equality and ecological restoration. It's not about restoring and I might just take the example you said, that resource. It's not about that. It's about really rejecting the fact that it is a resource, and we're thinking about, you know, relations and relationalities beyond commodification and exploitation. So no, it's that sense of solidarity that gives us hope to continue our struggles in different ways, especially those of us who have the privilege to speak and to be and to act. We should use that in every way possible.
Go ahead, Enam.
It's difficult really to make this better than what Muna just said. But what I would say is that, like, what I think about Gaza every day, and because it keeps us awake. I mean, the current phase of genocide is I think it woke us up, it shook us further, it keeps shaking us, because we have realized that we cannot afford to imagine that the harm will end and then reparative justice will start. That is not anymore possible. So the harm will continue. We will have to continuously repair and heal ourselves and prepare for the next day. And that's not going to change. That's we have to let that sink in. We have to fight to keep our hearts soft and humane, have the empathy, but we also have to, at the same time, make it hardened so we can brace what's happening and still survive. And that is going to be the same for climate change. With already what has happened, we cannot stop. We are just going to see more and more harms coming with the impacts that's going to be created. It cannot be mitigation and adaptation and loss and damage as technical terms. It would have to be a war that we are fighting, and we have to strategize our efforts and think like we are in a war, because we are. And we have to re-strategize, focus, and see like, okay, where people need support, when there's a cyclone, where there's a flood, but also where long-term sustainability, livability in a land is not possible. It's not going to produce food anymore, and people need to move to other countries and other areas, while not giving up the hope that we will go back, we will reclaim, we will heal the land someday. But we cannot force people to stay in their countries so they can take the responsibility to take care of it, heal it with their indigenous wisdom, because there is also a violence in that, putting the burden of taking care of a land that someone else made unlivable. So not in a hypothetical sense, we literally are, or we have entered a phase where the planet belongs to all of us, including our homes. And now is the time to show that we really believe in that. And we are, like, as I said, like, we cannot unhear. We cannot say that we don't have the knowledge and we don't have the responsibility to act. Now that we know, we have to start sharing, caring, and acting together. Over to you, Laila.
Thank you so much, Enam, and to all of our speakers. This was a wonderful place to end. And I think what I've heard from all of you really is something that I've been thinking for a while, that everything really genuinely is connected. I know that we often say that in sort of quite a flippant way, but you know, literally, practically, our struggles are connected. We're fighting kind of against the same oppression, you know, systemic oppression. And I feel, especially as the years go by, you know, I really feel that actually we're in a fight for our lives. And you know, I think, as Enam, you said there, we need to connect to our humanity and to our solidarity, and to resist the violence against us, to resist the commodification of our lives, because actually it's the only way that we're going to survive. And we need to do that together, and also really thinking about the knowledge and just the ways of thinking that we're using to do that. So the conversation today has been so informative, so thought-provoking. It has been moving and just really deeply personal and touching, but also actually very hopeful. And I thank you all for that, for sort of treating the subject with such care and gentleness. And I'm sure the audience have enjoyed the conversation as much as I have. I feel I've been in a very privileged position. I feel like you've all been talking to me directly, and I've learned a lot today. So thank you from the heart, and on behalf of our audience as well. And we will bring the webinar to a close now. Thank you ever so much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, I'm going to bed now. Night.
Oh, good night.
Lovely meeting you all, and we'll talk more soon.